Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Engstrom. I'm lead curator for the upcoming exhibition, Great Whales, Up Close and Personal. I'm really pleased that you could join us for today's Curator Conversation, which is a digital program that explores themes and subjects from the ROM collections alongside of those of our many professional partners. You can never do an exhibition alone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank TD for their ongoing support of this program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe Nation, including Mississaugas with the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. Today's program is in support of our upcoming exhibition, and we would like to acknowledge the support of the Royal Exhibition Circle donors in making the exhibition possible. And I went to go down to see it in progress yesterday, and it's really coming along. In these conversations, we'll have a conversation with our guest, and we'll have time for questions afterwards. I would like to welcome my guest for today's conversation, who is Tonya Wimmer. Tonya is marine mammal biologist and the founder and executive director of the Marine Animal Response Society, or as we know it as MARS, in Nova Scotia. Tonya works to help MARS achieve its goals to provide effective and safe responses to marine animal incidents while contributing valuable data and research to assess and mitigate the impacts of human activities on ocean environments. In 2017 and 2019, Tonya helped lead the response to an investigation of mass mortalities of right whales in Eastern Canada, in which the ROM was also involved. Today's presentation is one of a series of digital and in-person programs that will showcase the ROM's commitment to Canada's iconic North Atlantic whales. Our exhibition will open this summer, and I really hope that you'll be able to come and see it. So I'd like to welcome Tonya now to join us and say hello to the crowd.
Hello, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. First, I just wanted to say that I'm really happy to be here and acknowledge that I am calling in from Halifax in Mi'kmaq, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people.
Great. So I think I'd like to start, Tonya, just by asking a little bit about Mars. I think sometimes when people love whales, that's why we've done our two different exhibitions on them, and are really drawn to these iconic animals. But given people's strong interest in whales, it really might surprise everyone to know how many gaps there are in understanding of their ecology, of their movements, their reproduction, and various other aspects of their biology. So I wonder if you could discuss the role and importance of Mars in terms of continuing research and monitoring of whales on the East Coast?
Most definitely. And I actually, because you can't talk about whales and not show some video or pictures and whatnot, so I'm going to share my screen because I do have a few pictures that I can show Great. As we do this. Can you see a black screen at the moment?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, I mean, from a point of view of the fascination of these animals, I'm right up there with everybody. Since I was very small, my mother will attest to this, I wanted to study whales. I grew up in South Shore of Nova Scotia, and these animals just always really completely fascinated me. And, so I ended up going to Dalhousie, did my undergraduate and my graduate degree there. I was very fortunate to study some of these species, especially pilot whales up in the little black guys in the upper corner, and of course the right whales in the bottom right. And have done that around Nova Scotia and off of the coast here, and also in South America with some sperm whales, actually, which was phenomenal. But as you said, the other side too is as you learn more, you also learn what we don't know. And as you said, there's so much we don't know about these very enigmatic animals that are mammals like us, but live in a very different world, obviously. And so for me, that came to a head as I was finishing my undergraduate degree and moving into my graduate work, and I founded the organization known as MARS. And this was actually based off an organization that had been here, sort of had gone defunct a few years before then, called the Nova Scotia Stranding Network. But I sort of took that and built upon it and worked with others to enhance it. And now 20 years later, we work throughout the Maritime provinces. And as you said, like our really key focus has been about trying to understand these animals and trying to fill in some of those gaps. I will warn people that I'm doing a presentation about response. So there are images in here of dead animals and some injured ones. I try to choose them specifically to make them not too horrific. But sadly, this is also the nature of what we do. And it's really important that we can share this with this information and images with people. But just warn that if you need to, look away. So for us, I mean, really, we deal with the conservation of marine animals through and sort of two different avenues. One is through live response, so being able to help animals as appropriately as possible. So animals that have live stranded, for example, like our little pilot whale in my upper left, hopefully it's your upper left. We also have animals that become trapped. There's a right whale actually in amongst those boats. It's caught in a fish trap. There's a beluga on the bottom right where a whole bunch of people are lifting it out of the water. That animal went way up a river and was not really wanting to come out. And then other events like mass strandings. So we deal with all of these kind of events, but then we also, sadly, we deal with the animals which unfortunately have also died. And while these events are pretty tragic and they're not really great things to deal with in any stretch of the imagination, they are also one of the biggest wealths of information we have about learning about these animals. And that's really one of the biggest things for us is to, like you said, fill in some of those gaps about their biology, their ecology, what do they eat, how often do they reproduce, but also what's going on with them. Are we hurting them? Are they stressed? Which a lot of people don't think about with whales, but they can, just like us. And for us, it's about doing this for all species that exist here. We have probably almost 25 different whale, dolphin, porpoise species. And we try to do this for all of them, not just sort of these very few government priority species that they've identified. And really, it's about working with so many other people to be able to figure out what we can learn and essentially how we can help them.
So Tonya, you and I met, I think the first time we met was working on a fin whale that had died off of Cape Breton. Yep. And we've continued in that program ever since. And we've often been involved when there's been necropsies, as you discussed. And I wonder what you could say specifically about what do the results of these necropsies tell us? What do we learn from looking at these whales that have unfortunately passed away?
Most definitely. And I'm really glad you asked that question because and that we're going to get to discuss it, because I can't sort of emphasize enough how important necropsies, which are autopsies on animals that we do. I cannot emphasize enough, pardon me, how important those investigations are, because really that's how we get a complete look, as complete as we can, at these animals and what happens. They're done very systematically. I know a lot of people have questions about them, and I'll walk you through a little bit about how we do them, because it's an interesting process. But the biggest thing is always reassuring people, and we talk about this with lots of different people, that they're done very systematically. They're it matter the size of the animal, and we very much work with our veterinary colleagues to do this. It's about looking at the animal layer by layer, sadly, but layer by layer, to look through all their tissues, all their bones, their organs, and try to find out anything possible that could be a factor in their health or what may have happened to them. So even if it looks obvious, we still try to do as complete as possible. Now, as you can imagine, this is quite straightforward when you're dealing with small animals, in a sense that you can pick up, or at least with a few people can pick up and take into beautiful facilities like those at the Atlantic Veterinary College. And we work with the veterinary pathologists there through the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. These are fairly straightforward things to do. But the interesting thing is when you get a situation like this, where you have a blue whale that's about 70 feet long, or a right whale that is about 50 to 60 feet long. And I'll point out that this right whale here is actually the one that you guys have in your exhibit, and everyone will hopefully get to see very soon. You guys have his skeleton. So when dealing with these, this is a really very complex thing, because these are massive animals. Blue whales and right whales, even of both of sort of these sizes, can weigh upwards of 60, 70, 100 tons. This is not the same as dealing with a few 100-pound dolphin. And so really what this takes is a huge amount of coordination. It takes an awful lot of people, very dedicated people. It takes equipment and stuff you probably don't even think you would need, like ladders, because these animals are so big, we have to be able to get physically on top of them. And probably the most important piece of equipment are actually excavators. And so we couldn't actually open these animals without the help of some heavy machineries. They're just too big to even handle, to move. I mean, their heads are bigger than, almost a car, almost 2 cars in length. And so for everyone's safety, it really is about how to do this properly. The biggest thing I'll mention with this is that, sometimes cause of death is obvious. We might see a big wound on the animal. We might see gear from fishing or other activities or debris. But for many other types of impacts like vessel strikes, ingesting plastics, whether they are impacted by noise or other pollution, the evidence for that's internal. So the big thing for us is that, we have to be able to look inside to figure what happened. Or people might think nothing happened to the animal, it was fine. Maybe it was just a mistake or it died naturally. But we need to be able to look inside to find some of this evidence. And the big thing is that data that we collect is the foundations for conservation. So doing these kind of investigations, this is what tells us why they died. It tells us what happened to them. And then that information helps people figure out what to do next, how to help protect them. And the biggest thing for us is, we make a case to do necropsies on all kinds of species. And because our motto is, if we don't look, we don't know. And something may be going on that we're missing. And we really don't want to be in a situation similar to where we're getting with right whales, is that we don't want to ever be questioning if we're too late. That, we only have 350 animals left of right whales. And the question always is there with a lot of people, is it too late to save them? And so we want the information before we get to that stage. The other thing too is that these investigations offer a really valuable opportunity to support a lot of research. So we collect a lot of information. We collect samples from as many animals as possible. Baleen goes to people for hormones, skin and blubber for hormone work on stress and reproduction. And then the other thing too is, obviously, where we can, we support the archival, the education, and the research work that are done by museums, such as ROM and many others. And so this is actually your blue whale from a few years ago. Very excited, can't wait to see the new exhibit with all of the animals, including this guy. But it came from a stranded animal. So that support is huge, and to be able to do that with these necropsies.
So I think it leads to our next question, Tonya, which is, we became involved with the blue whale when it got into the news, because we had nine animals had died in the ice. Then more recently, there's been a continual spate of news about right whales and so on, among others. And so it's obvious that on the East Coast, there are a number of threats to whales. And there's a large number of organizations working to try to mitigate those threats. But I wonder if you could think of what the most significant factors that are impacting conservation of whales in the North Atlantic in the short term, at least in the immediate issues that are impacting whales.
Yeah, and sadly, it's one of those things we actually have some information on. We obviously need more, but there are many threats to these animals, but really for most species, and including especially our large whale species, there's two main ones. Those are entanglements in gear that are from fishing activities and other activities that are in our ocean. Animals actually getting caught up in ropes and in other parts of gear. And then we also have, sadly, vessel strikes. So this is where an animal gets struck. These are all accidental occurrences. No one is ever intending to do this, but it's the sad reality of our activities, it being in the same place and time as these animals. So these are sort of the two main ones. We have lots of others I've mentioned, ingesting plastics and noise pollution and things like that. But unfortunately, every year in Canada and globally, these are the two main causes of death to these animals. And and we see it also for humpbacks, for minkies, for harbor porpoises. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I will warn people, these next images are a little harsh to see. Not that this one isn't, it's awful. But the other thing too is that it isn't even just about what kills the animals. There's a lot of focus, especially by our government, on what kills the animals. But the sad reality is that our activities are also really hurting these animals. So these are pictures of the animals' heads. You can see a little bit of one of the tails. All of the horribleness that looks on there are scars and wounds from having been wrapped up in gear, having been hit by vessels. The animal down in the right corner, which has some gear on it, you can see there's the baleen. It's that long fringe kind of hanging out at a weird angle. It should be hanging down, but it's got so much gear in there that it's actually pulled it up and out of the way. And this is I can't even emphasize enough how serious this side of the issue is. And sadly, it's something that really hasn't been focused on a lot in terms of their conservation. Because this, while it didn't kill the animal, it hurts them, it hurts their ability to feed, it can hurt their ability to reproduce. And for females, it can be really hindering in terms of if they can have or raise a baby, which is obviously what we need them to do to keep existing on the planet. And so this really fundamentally is, ethically and morally, this is a huge issue. These animals are in huge amounts of pain and suffering, which they never, and no one should ever, this should never happen. But the other side of this is also a legal obligation. In Canada, these are all right whales, which is a listed species. And under our Species at Risk Act, we're not allowed to harm, harass, disturb, or kill. But the harm, harass, disturb is also in there. And also under our Species at Risk Act, we're also supposed to not want other species to get harmed or become listed, or in that much trouble either. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of being able to deal with this aspect and making sure that it is actually being considered. And these are things in the short term. It impacts them long term, but these are things that are, that really need to be addressed now. And this sublethal, these long term, not killing them impacts are quite severe.
So we're, I know in the exhibition, we cover a lot of these topics and what is being done by various organizations to try to lessen the impacts of, to have ropeless gear and that sort of thing, to try to minimize these kinds of impacts. But we also have other kinds of threats to whales and the marine environments in general, which include long-term factors, so one of which is global warming. And do you see climate change as a serious threat to our eastern whales?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, and I'll flip this so that people don't have to keep looking at these poor animals, but most definitely. And I mean, it's actually one of the things people have been thinking about a lot, because the main sort of impact we're seeing from this climate change is that oceans are warming. And when oceans warm up, the animals that are in it may not be able to stay in the spot because it's gotten warmer. And so we see that with some of the little things that our animals are eating, copepods and plankton and fish. And so they start shifting their distribution. And like us, we follow the buffet. And so the whales and other predators move to different locations. And the problem with that is that they may be moving into areas that are unfamiliar to them. They may be moving into areas where there are new threats, or that the threats they've already been experiencing are even more severe. The other side of that equation is that they potentially are moving into areas where humans have not thought about the conservation of those species in that area at all. And that is a really dangerous combination. And especially because humans don't tend to be as proactive, or, and especially even some of the governments and, how they function is about the issue at hand, maybe not necessarily thinking that far down as to what could happen, although more people are. The best example to illustrate this are the North Atlantic right whales. So what you see here is sort of the little diagram of right whale, or the little illustration, and the two green dots. Those areas off southern New Brunswick and Nova Scotia for decades were the main spots that everyone thought that right whales really aggregate in Canada. Now, oceans are changing, they're warming up. The animals there, people have been studying them. They seem to disappear after about 2010. It's very hard to find a right whale in those areas, which really leads a lot of panic. There's not many. And so it started to beg the question, well, where did they go? And what we found is that sort of in 2013, 14, we started to find and get reports that they were in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And since that period, they've actually been in there in quite high numbers, 100 animals, 100, almost 50 animals every year. And the issue is that in that area, no one had really been working on a big scale conservation of those species. Although I will highlight, we knew that some of the same threats, fishing entanglements and vessel strikes, were occurring there because it happened to other species. But now the right whales were in there. And so that led to a lot of concern about what do we do? Because there was a big shift for people to all of a sudden shift gears and work in a totally different area that they hadn't before. And the unfortunate side effects of that is that we did see deaths. And so in 2015, there were 3 right whale deaths in that area that's sort of highlighted by the red dot. At that point, we had very little support from the government to be able to do these necropsies. I think only 1 got done. And that was under a lot of pressure to make sure that happened. But then 2017 happened, and we had 12 dead right whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, one of the most horrific things I think I've ever been involved in. But it certainly put a light bulb on for a lot of people, including our government. And they really started putting a lot of emphasis in helping us get these animals. And it really put a spotlight on Canada from the world. It was really interesting to sort of be part of. Unfortunately, in 2019, we also then had a further 9 animals that died. So it really has shone a light on the movements that these animals may happen or sort of undertake because of something like climate change is really potentially significant. And not just for right whales, but every species. We've been seeing lots of newer species or ones we would think were from somewhere else in our waters. And it's really begging the question of why are they coming here? Is this a permanent shift? What do we have to be concerned about for them? And I think that's the big thing, is that it's hard to predict what's going to happen, but that's why we need to understand. And I sort of harp on this a lot, but it's we need to understand the health of these animals. You know, it isn't just about acoustically or visually even detecting them and saying they're here. We need to know, are they healthy? Are they getting enough food? Are they having enough babies? Because if they shift into some of these areas, my question is, are they resilient enough to last there? Are they strong enough? Are they able to withstand threats? And you know, that's a big question for us with Mars, is trying to figure out some of those answers and work with other to figure it out.
Yeah, and that's the same. The things we obviously we were involved in the 2007, one of the 2017 the crop season. That animal is on display, and a very long history of having him followed, about 40 years worth of known history of that animal. And the same thing happened when in the original blue whale incident, which were involved, where we had 9 blue whales, which were farther north than they normally would be at that time of year, presumably following krill, which is you know, but it was what they eat, and they became trapped in ice. So I think there's a lot of I think people may not understand how significant global warming has been, and the effects on climate change. The farther north you go, the stronger the effect becomes. I wonder if you know, I think we've talked a lot about threats and things that are impacting whales, and I think for an audience, particularly one centered here in the GTA and not right next to the ocean, I think people become very concerned and often want to know how they can contribute. What can somebody from, you know, the GTA do to contribute to solving some of these problems, or reducing the impact of what's going on the East Coast?
Most definitely. And I mean, you know, even initially from a local perspective, if there are people who are, you know, from my neck of the woods who are listening, I mean, for us, you know, the biggest thing anyone can do, and it's the same as if once we see what happens with border and travel, but anyone who even has cottages here, if they know the toll-free number, and if they see anything that's alive in trouble or dead, they call us immediately. That's sort of the first step that everyone absolutely can do if they happen to be in this area. The other thing for people locally, for us, that's really important, are they can volunteer with us. We are only successful because we have incredible and caring people in our communities and our industries and our First Nations who help us do this work. Mars only has 2 full-time people and a smattering of other people who are part-time. It's very small despite what we have been able to accomplish, but it's because we have these incredible people that work with us. So that's one thing from a local perspective. For people that are, like I said, that are listening, who are from, you know, the GTA and other cities or inland, you know, who obviously, you know, they're not next to our ocean, but I'm sure they care about them as much as we do. And really, there are several things. I mean, there very much are, you know, if you're going to visit areas, if you're going whale watching on ecotourisms, choose wisely. Find the ones that really have a dedication to the protection of these animals and conduct themselves sustainably. That's one step in terms of, you know, if you happen to be out. If you're going to, whether it's, like I said, the Maritimes, and knowing our hotline or volunteering for us while you're here, I would also say that there are networks and organizations in BC, Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador. You go there, get to know them, and know how to get a hold of them if you need them. The other thing, I mean, obviously, like you've mentioned, there's a lot of organizations that are highlighted also through this exhibit. And for the most part, we're all NGOs. We're not for profits. Some of us are charities. And, you know, we don't exist unless we have support. And so people can donate, or they can help us buy equipment. It's essentially, we're like any other first responder. We have phone lines we keep running 24/7, people who man those or human those lines. You know, we have exceptional people who are highly trained, who run out the door and drop everything when things happen. They train others. They study these events. And of course, a myriad of equipment. It's incredible the different bits and bobs we've accumulated in terms of knives and necropsy gear, all of our PPE, boats, trucks, generators, freezers. Freezers are an incredible source of value. If we actually had an office, which is another thing, we'd love to have freezers to put stuff. But yeah, I mean, rescue pontoons and stretchers, all of that kind of stuff. The other thing I would say, and I know it sounds a little cliche, but small actions help. You know, things like, and again, this is going to sound cliche, but they're really important. Recycling, you know, reducing our waste, not littering, reducing carbon footprint. When you go on the water, acting responsibly and, you know, sustainably when you're around animals in the ocean. I can't emphasize how much that matters. And, you know, for people who deal with dead animals or hurt ones, where sometimes it's because there's gear or debris or litter on them, you know, or they've ingested something, it's a horrible thing for us to deal with. It's a really horrible thing for these animals. And, you know, so even those little things are huge. Participating in beach cleanups, whether they're on a lake, whether they're in on a park, is huge, because that all ends up, a lot of it ends up in the ocean, and sadly ends up in these or other animals. The other thing I would strongly encourage people to do is get engaged. Go and learn about these animals. This exhibit you guys are doing is going to be phenomenal. I really hope I get to see it before it goes. I will. I'll come wrapped in a bubble if I need to, but I would strongly encourage people to learn as much as possible. And the other big thing is to engage with government. This, you know, our oceans obviously are really important to actually the functioning of our climate. These animals are incredibly important cyclers of carbon and nutrients. You know, one whale is worth almost 1,000 trees. So if we can save the whales and bring them back, we will do a huge, we'll have a huge buffer and help us with resilience when it comes to climate change. So engaging with government is massive. You know, they do consultations all the time, species at risk. They've got a blue ocean strategy they're working on. Canada has commitments to the UN's Decade of Ocean Science, telling them that this is important to you, to the country, to our natural legacy as Canadians. It is leaps and bounds, because without that kind of pressure, this doesn't tend to fall to the top of the political pile. And so I would strongly encourage people to do that, because, you know, without them, these animals, we have a very upward sort of hill to climb when it comes to some things like climate change. I never like to end anything on a bad note or unhappy note, so I will just end it by saying that for me, my overall goal is to make sure these animals get to live very happy, healthy lives. And I'm selfish in that way somewhat, because I also really want to be able to continue to enjoy them, and for future generations to be able to continue to enjoy them virtually and in person where possible. So
Thank you, Tonya, and I totally agree in your assessment of what people could do, and in particular, I think if people may not realize the impact that they can have in making their opinions known to their governments. People actually really listen, and it's not a wasted effort.
no.
So I want to thank you, Tonya, for joining us. And I'm hoping that you'll definitely be able to come and see the exhibition, and so will the visitors to our program here today. So Tonya and I are now going to answer some of your questions for the next few minutes. And as a reminder, your questions can be submitted via the Q&A feature on your screen. So we're happy to answer questions. I've got to let Tonya answer most of them, though she's our guest.
If I can, I hope so. Yes, and I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the Q&A as I go along here, or if Aaron's jumping in.
No, I've got a few that have come up that I've kind of grouped together just so that you can have a good conversation. The first one is about Mars itself. People are very interested in the organization, how it functions. So, what kind of other organizations you work with and you outreach to, and do you get any funding from government bodies to do this really important work?
Most definitely. I mean, so essentially, I mean, like I said, Mars was founded 20 years ago, and I was probably an incredibly naive undergrad student. I can't emphasize that enough. However, very passionate about this work and that it needed to happen. And so it it has been a struggle to sort of do this work. I mean, people recognize the importance, but it has, especially under certain governments, been very difficult to get funding for it. We do now get some funding from government. It's very important to us. It doesn't cover all of our activities. It covers some pieces of it. So for us, the other funding comes from donations, foundations, applying for grants, working on projects. So we've been able to sort of move it ahead, but it has always stayed very small. And we're always looking for room to expand. We have lots of students and interns who always ask us how to get involved. But for us, we have a very small core group of 2 or 3 people who help keep everything moving. And then we have a lot of on-call responders that actually help us, and this huge group of volunteers that make it actually happen. Because without them, it wouldn't be possible on 2 shoulders. We actually had only 2 people for probably about the first 10 years, and it was a doozy for us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tonya. There are a number of people actually asking about whale watching, because that's obviously something that, you know, inspires people to really, you know, learn to love these animals. But do you have any thoughts about pros and cons of those types of experiences, and how can you tell if they're eco-friendly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, because obviously anytime we're interacting with the animal, it raises the question of, should we be doing it? That's any wildlife when you think about it. You know, the more we sort of get up and close and personal, will that have an effect that's detrimental to the animal? There's been a lot of research on this, and what people are finding is that if it's done carefully and in certain ways and limited time frames, you can have a really lovely, enjoyable experience. I mean, I know everyone wants to stay with them for hours. I want to stay with them for days. But it is about us sort of having that fine balance. And there are really great whale watchers all across Canada, who in many areas, there are voluntary codes of conduct. There are now regulations from our government about approaching animals and how close you can get to them. The other thing is if you can approach, like, say, moms and babies, and you try to leave them be because they need to do what they need to do. So very much, I would, you know, people can have a look in local areas and see it and ask questions. You know, do they follow a code of conduct? You know, do they have education or naturalists on board who will provide information about the animals? Is there research that they do while on board some of those whale watches? Because many do. And I think those are very valuable questions to be able to ask when you're booking and looking for places to go.
Okay, so there are some additional questions, just kind of going back to Mars and how you can get involved, whether or not the people that you work with have any specific training or backgrounds in biology or marine biology.
No, we take everybody. I mean, I mean, I say that very loosely. I shouldn't be so cavalier, but it really, I mean, we work with people in all of our communities. I mean, there's an age restriction. We don't obviously allow people too young to get involved, because they can be dangerous situations when it's a live animal. We very much invite anyone, because it's really the passion of the people in our communities. And for a lot of people, it's a limitation on their own. You know, if they have physical limitations or health limitations, they may not be able to do some things. But for us, even when we're on site, having people there who have a camera for us, who are taking notes, who are helping talk to the public, or maybe even keeping people back. There are lots of different ways that people can get involved. We do get a lot of students. Halifax is overwhelmed, wonderfully with students from our universities. But it isn't necessary to, you know, have a background in biology or with the whales, for example. We do training that sort of gives people the basic information they need, but we welcome anyone.
But you probably have to be comfortable being in the water with a whale.
Somewhat. I mean, and that's the thing, is that and I mean, the other side of it, that's probably the part people get very excited about, and we teach people how to be comfortable, and we also gauge them in the sense that if it doesn't seem to be a right fit, then maybe it won't be. The worst part is for people is more that if we deal with dead animals, I will say. I mean, it's to be able to do, and Mark will know this firsthand, it's not a pleasant thing to do from even an emotional point of view, but they smell. You can't get around it. It's not an overly pleasant thing to do, and not everyone can do it, and that's fine.
So picking up on the necropsies,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of interest in how many you do, sort of what percentage end up in a museum, what happens with the ones that don't. There's a lot of interest in where they go.
Yes, so it's a very interesting question in terms of how many we do. We, with our colleagues in Quebec and Newfoundland, are just actually finishing up sort of a 15-year retrospective looking at all the different whale, dolphin, porpoise incidents on the east coast of Canada. And one of the questions we had was, well, how often do we figure out cause of death, and whether it's from necropsy or obvious? And the answer is very few. And really, the right whales are probably the highest percentage, because we have a lot of support to do right whales. But a floating blue whale, a floating fin whale, we rarely get those brought ashore to look at. So sadly, very few animals actually get necropsy, which we're really working with our veterinary colleagues and others to change, and to find the funding and the support to do that. When we do a necropsy, what happens to the animal after really depends on what requests we have. So, for example, when the right whales first started dying in 2017, we were immediately in contact with Mark and Jackie and others at ROM about how can they get one of these skeletons, as well as samples for research. So sometimes that's the case. Other times, with many of them, they're buried. And so we have to work very closely with the provinces and whatnot to make sure when we bring an animal in, or if we're working in an area, that we're allowed to do what we need to do there, or they're taken to landfills.
Do you have any thoughts on whether or not sound pollution or other types of pollution have impacted these mass mortality events that you've been investigating over the last couple of years?
We did. So the one trick with, chemical pollution is one thing, and being able to look at pollutants, and people have been doing that with some animals like belugas. They're quite a sort of specialist and a bit of a different kind of a procedure. So it's not necessarily something we can figure out just looking at doing a necropsy in the moment. With noise pollution, that's a really interesting one, because it has been coming up more and more, because we have a lot of activity, and we've had seismic and oil and gas activity and other things. So with the 2017 and 2019 events, we did look to see if there had been any reports of events or permitted events going on in the Gulf of St. Lawrence or the approaches. Were there seismic work going on? Was there dredging? Was there pile driving? Anything? We didn't see any. We didn't get any word that there had been. There's a few potentially in 2019 that may have happened for short periods. The one real complicated part with necropsies and looking for something like that is that if you're looking for damage to, say, ear bones, the animal has to be really fresh. And the problem we ran into in 2017 is it took a really long time to convince the government to actually help us bring the carcasses in to look at, and the importance of that. And so by the time we got to the animals, many of them were really far gone. And sadly, that's what happens in many cases, is that we hear about the animal, but by the time you can get access to it, get people there, it may have been dead for a little while. And so we lose a bit of some of that evidence. So for us, we also highlight, we need to do them right away. We need to get to the animal. We need to do it as soon as possible. We do have people, though, that are working on noise from a sort of a more indirect perspective, in a sense of looking at stress hormones. And again, this is why I emphasize health as well, because potentially, these animals are getting killed by some of these other activities, but noise in general, and many humans know this as well, is that sound can have a very deep impact on us in terms of our health, in terms of our stress loads and stuff like that. And the same happens for these animals. They're finding that they do have quite high stress loads. And so we have people within fisheries and oceans and elsewhere who are studying that kind of aspect as well. And hopefully we'll be able to find out more about how things like noise are actually impacting these animals too.
That's one of the, I was just mentioning, that's one of the things we discussed in the exhibition, which is about communication and about noise pollution, and how some of the oceans become very, very noisy. And many of these whales are communicating over long distances. Yep. And that can, obviously, that noise, that background noise, can and does interfere with their especially long distance communication.
Most definitely. I mean, these are acoustic animals where we use our, these are some of our primary senses, is the use of vision in a terrestrial environment. For animals in the ocean, sound is everything. You think of being under the water and banging rocks together as a kid or whatever, and you can hear them a really long distance. That's how they communicate. It's easier for them than trying to see through murky water. And, so even besides physical damage or things that it could do, that if interfering with communicating and finding food and talking and locating their babies is a really serious problem.
So, question from Mark. how does the work that Mars is doing feed into genetic work that the ROM is working on, and how is that being reflected in the exhibition?
So one of the things, so the ROM is done. We've done, in addition to doing exhibition work, we've been doing some research on the whales. I'll just give you an example from the blue whale. We've actually sequenced the genome of the whale, the whale that was in Trout River, which was the one on display, which was a first. And we've been able to examine about 50 other specimens of whales, both historical and recent, of blue whales for tissues. And we've been able to determine, for example, that with blue whales, the populations in the Eastern and Western Atlantic appear to be a single population, which is great news. It means that we aren't just reduced to the animals that happen to be on the West Coast, along Canada. We've also found that the whales in themselves are highly heterozygous, which means they're quite genetically variable, which sometimes you get what's called bottlenecking, or you get reduced variation in small populations, which can be detrimental to the long-term success of the population. That does not appear to have been the case. And we're also finding increasing rates over time of hybridization of blue whales with fin whales, which is an interesting phenomenon. Appears to be male fin whales with female blue whales. So all of those things impact the potential management of the species. And for example, just determining that we have East and West Coast populations, we don't have separate Eastern European populations and Canadian populations, means that we can consider them a single group, hopefully, and depending on their degree of site fidelity, and that we may be, that we're not so far behind the eight ball as we might have been with the blue whale. So those were samples that we obtained through necropsies. And likewise, we obtained some genetic samples from some of the right whales, which we're beginning to work on now. So the ROM is not just displaying animals and hopefully educating the public about these issues. We're also contributing to the research that's being the ongoing research that's being done that hopefully will benefit the whales.
Thank you, Mark. I think we have time for one big question and maybe one small one before we have to end. So the big question has to do with fisheries. There's a lot of chatter with our audience about the merits of looking at sustainable seafood, how fisheries being managed may impact both, the entanglement issue, the boat strikes, but also the movement of populations with changing fish stocks. Do either of you have any sort of stories about how that may have impacted your own work?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm really glad people asked that question, because I forgot to mention about sustainable seafood choices when you're buying seafood. Obviously, that's a huge one. I mean, the issue of fisheries, obviously, we've known about the impacts, especially to right whales, for a very long time, fishing and vessel strikes. And so there's been quite a bit of work in especially in the US at first, around what they do, how they manage fisheries. The laws are very different in both countries, so it's been moving in different paths. But I mean, the big thing is that since the 2017 die-off of these right whales, there has been a huge movement in Eastern Canada around looking at fisheries, looking at how they operate, working, and especially what we've been saying for ages is working directly with fishers about their operations. How can they modify the practices to see if they can figure out how to do it with less rope in the water? Because really, ultimately it's rope. And it isn't even putting the blame solely on the shoulders of fishers. There's lots of other industries out there that use rope, but East Coast is very much a fishing part of the nation, and so it is the primary industry. But there's been huge leaps and bounds, and our Canadian government really has gone beyond what everyone even thought they were probably capable of doing about managing and trying to put in place measures to reduce the impacts to these animals. And there's been huge involvement by industry as well. That's the other thing that really came together. Probably the only good thing that came out of the events that have happened in the last 5 years are this sort of coming together of all these people with the different expertises and aspects of their element of life to put together to try to solve the problem. And that's really the only way any of these big problems can get solved. There's always worry that if the animals keep shifting, the problem will go into a new area, but hopefully there's some element now about being proactive and saying, okay, well, if that works there, well, then maybe we can make that transition before we lose any more animals, which would be huge. But that's really, and then of course that's linked to these industries becoming more sustainable, and obviously giving us as consumers choices of food we could eat that support sort of those conservation efforts.
Should we assume that to varying degrees, all of these issues impact whale populations in the Arctic and the West Coast as well?
Most definitely. I mean, this is not an isolated East Coast issue at all. It's, I mean, globally bycatch, which is sort of that capture of animals in bits of gear and stuff, is one of the most severe problems we have on the planet. It is not even a large whale solely problem. There's actually even more small animals like dolphins and porpoises that die every year, probably like 300,000 or more animals globally, which is a shocking number. And it happens on the East Coast. In the Arctic, there's less fishing, but with the global warming and the ice melting, there's interest to move in with industries, and some are in there. So there's a huge concern for the species in the Arctic and what that changing landscape for them could mean.
Yeah, I think it's very true. If you look at the Arctic, there's no place in the world that's been more impacted by climate change than the Arctic, and in particular the extent of summer sea ice. And as that decreases rapidly over time, the fishing industries will be moving in there, and this is going to be an increasing problem in the Arctic.
Sadly, yeah.
And just to end on a nicer note, last question for both of you. Do either of you have any happy stories that you'd like to share about either a good experience you had with maybe getting an animal back out into the world to enjoy its life, or maybe from Mark's side, do you have any good stories about how people have really taken this story within the ROM community and run with it?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to go first, Mark?
Sure.
Oh, we have stories. I mean, I could tell you all about seeing my first blue whale and almost crying because it was massive and I felt like I could sit in its blowhole, and I can still hear its voice. Anyway, but from a perspective of dealing with these animals, I mean, we've had so many incredible experiences of, and they don't necessarily always have great outcomes. I mean, but we've definitely had some, removing our little beluga from a river in northern New Brunswick, which was a huge multi-group, and people in Quebec and DFO in both, which is Fisheries and Oceans, in both areas, fire departments, lots of people coming together to get this little beluga who had just stubbornly wanted to go up a river, putting it in a plane, sending it back, putting it in the water in Quebec. Lovely group, story about all those people that are involved. The animal ended up coming back, and we found it a year later off Cape Breton, and it brought a friend. So maybe that didn't work so well, but it was alive, which was great. But I mean, I think for me, the biggest stories and the things that are almost most appreciative for me and within Mars are where the public and people work with us in their hearts about really wanting to help these animals. And we've had people do incredible things, obviously always with safety in mind, but fire departments who will stop traffic on either side of a bridge because dolphins went up a river and they wouldn't go back under it to get out because of the sound. And so they blocked a bridge, and it was like the only road into town, and all the people were there supporting, and no one was upset about it because everyone just wanted to help these animals. And I think that's probably, for me, one of the big things to even still keep going. And it's the energy that people give me to keep doing this work.
Yeah, I would say for me, I have a more general response, which is when we do something for the public, like we do obviously we've done our research, which I think is going to have an impact on the survival of whales, which for me is very satisfying. But one of the things that really made a difference to me in doing the first exhibition, and hopefully the second exhibition, kind of relates to the very first question I asked Tonya, which is people need to get some sense of how little we know about whales. And it's true of lots of other organisms as well. And I think people tend to think, oh, we know everything. So there's no point in my going into marine biology or science or anything else because we know it all. Well, we know very little. And I had about 3 different responses to the first exhibition where people told me that they were inspired to go into marine biology because of the exhibition. And I had another woman who decided to go into museum work because of the exhibition. And that for me is the greatest impact that I could have, is to, if we can inspire people to take up this cause, to become, to dedicate more time, or even to become a professional in this field. That for me would be the most satisfaction I could have out of an exhibition and out of the program.
All right, thank you both for those questions. I think, or answering those questions. I think that's all that we have time for today. So I will pass it back to Mark.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much for Tonya for joining, for coming and speaking today. It was really great to hear from you. Again, it's been a long time since we first met off of Cape Breton with a fin whale, but it's been a very enjoyable and I think fruitful journey. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again for our next digital program on June 30th. Details of all the upcoming ROM at Home online programs can be found on the ROM's website and our social media channels. So again, thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it today.